I'm Ellen Faurot-Daniels. I'm one of the environmental scientists with OSPR, primarily in charge of the Applied Response Technologies program, and as we talked about it a little bit more in detail, we'll talk also about the oil spill cleanup agent licensing, which I do for the state, and then I end up kind of being in the thick of things with Jordan and others on kind of the policy end of stuff. So for today, it's going to be I think fishery closure was kind of complex. I mean, the ART is kind of a tangled web that we've woven too. But we'll tell you a little bit about both the federal and the state relationships with ART and how it functions in spill response. And to do that, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of background and some of that grind stuff on legislation and regulations. Some of that will relate specifically to oil spill cleanup agents and how we at the state handle that a little bit differently than the US EPA does for the federal level. And because I think lots of times people think, when they think of oil spill cleanup agents or ARTs, they primarily think of dispersants. That's usually what jumps into your head first. So we'll talk a little bit about the dispersant plan, what we've been doing and are doing in California to try and keep that up to date and proactive and protective. Also talk about the other major category of ART, which is in situ burning, and hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions and discussion at the end. I haven't totally knocked you out with too many words by then. So here's our definition of ART. ART itself, the A in ART has gone by different names before. It's either been alternative, as you know, an alternative to the conventional mechanical response technologies. There was kind of a move to call it something besides alternative because people wanted it to be more in the mix, to be considered more on an even playing field with other technologies. We keep talking about wanting to have all our response tools in the toolbox, but then we give more consideration to some than others. So alternatives seem to kind of put it in that sort of runner-up category. So instead we called it applied. And to me that is still, I don't know, a little bit problematic. What does that mean? But that's what the A stands for right now. It stands for Applied Response Technologies. And during Deepwater Horizon, we started thinking of response technologies as kind of a collective, and then just broke out mechanical and chemical and biological agents separately. We kind of threw them all into the same stew when we were analyzing them. So I touched on this really briefly already. There's basically only two kinds of ART. You use an oil spill cleanup agent, or you burn the oil. Those are the two things, two broad classes aside from mechanical response, or not doing anything, natural recovery that we consider in oil spill response. So those two broad classes. Under oil spill cleanup agents, we have a whole suite of things we could potentially use. And the heavy hitter on that one is dispersants. But there are other chemicals too that we'll talk about, including bioremediants and some non-chemical sorbents. And not having been here for the other day, I don't know what you guys have touched on already or not, so if I start to drone on stuff that you've already heard plenty about, raise your hand and make me move on. You probably talked about the general categories of response options. So they can include dispersants and other oil spill cleanup agents, and they would almost certainly include skimmers and the conventional mechanical equipment that we've come to know and love. That will be the first out of the door, always. It will always be our intent primarily to try and address an oil spill by getting it off the water and actually removing it from the environment. So the containment boom for concentrating the oil, the skimmers for slurping it up, or other technologies for actually getting the oil off the water will be the primary and preferred response tool. But there are limits to what they can do. There are limits to what they can do in our, especially offshore situations, or when we get into sensitive habitats where the disturbance of mechanical recovery will be a factor that you just have to kind of consider. So we try to include these as kind of a suite of options, and some might fit the situation better than others, and they won't all fit. So dispersants and other cleanup agents we consider. Some we've used. Skimmers will certainly be used where appropriate. Containment and sort of boom, always. In-situ burning, sometimes. You can use more than one at a time. You don't have to pick just one exclusively. There are little niches in response, just as there are niches in anything we look at. This is one of those things that, to me, seems obvious. And I think, can't be my chest, there's a microphone. I think we all know this. I mean, there's something about it that, yeah, of course, once the oil is spilled, there's going to be injury to the environment. We think we accept that. We know that. You get right down to it, though, and you get into an oil spill response and dealing with these different approaches or alternatives, and you find out that what the general sense of the public, and I think and politicians and other folks that are representing our resources, is that somehow they want that not to have happened. And they definitely don't, we don't either. We don't want to do anything that makes that worse. So whatever we do, even though it may be seeming to add insult to injury, really, we don't do that unless we think there's going to be some net gain, some modest net gain. And a net gain in a situation where you have an incredible amount of harm is pretty hard to achieve. And as we're talking about things like dispersants, I think people keep thinking, well, there you go, adding insult to injury. You're making it worse. You think you're doing something better, but you're making it worse. And what we try to do with all our planning is try to only consider the use of dispersants when we really think we have the best scientific, reasonable expectation that no, we're going to actually improve things, at least modestly. So we're not going to get all the way oil out of the environment, but we do want to try and mitigate the mess as much as we can. So if we can't, talk about this a little bit, if we can't avoid the injuries, there are probably some cases where you can have oil spills and there won't be much in the way of injuries, and you can just find out. You know, oil spill far offshore, if it's tending to push further offshore, it may make more sense to let natural weathering process act on that oil. We have fewer environmental resources the further we get offshore, and it gets more dangerous to deploy human resources to try and work on that spill as we get further offshore. So sometimes not doing anything is actually the best thing. But when it's closer to shore and affecting the greater abundance and diversity of critters closer to shore, then you're trying to figure out a way to mitigate the injury that you expect will occur. And in doing that, this is where you get to play being an environmental scientist. You're looking at the short-term versus the long-term impacts. If something can actually withstand a short-term impact, is that better to do that, knowing that you're going to provide a longer-term benefit to a host of other critters that are perhaps more sensitive? So that's what we're trying to do. We're doing that whole trade-off analysis, and it sounds harsh. Why should we have to trade something off? Why can't we save everything? But the fact is, once that oil spills, something will be lost. And what we're trying to do is steer the losses to the resources that can better sustain it and recover from it. So all those decisions have their trade-offs, their pros and their cons. Whether you use mechanical, we're used to seeing mechanical, and I think lots of times people don't realize that there are injuries that can occur with the use of mechanical response equipment, especially as you get into the more sensitive habitats. And we're aware of those, and we try to mitigate for those too. But we've got to be careful in any response choice we make. So whether it's mechanical or dispersants or burning, each will have a consequence, and hopefully each will have a benefit. And you're trying to drive toward the benefits. Okay, so I'm going to start talking a little bit about ARTs in California, because California is different. Big surprise, California is special. Because we have OSPR in California and we have legislation that drove the creation of OSPR, right about the same time, OPA 90 was established to drive federal response planning. We had the Lemper-Keene C-Strand Act, which drives state response planning. And we have an OSPR administrator, And he currently has the state's authority over all the response technologies, all, mechanical and alternative for applying. Has the authority over all response technologies to address an on-water oil spill, and this is for state waters. It can be marine waters or fresh water. So it can be Lake Tahoe, it can be rivers, it can be Shasta Lake, or it can be marine or San Francisco Bay or whatever, all state waters. On the kind of the upper end of that, we have a federal regional response team, and have you guys heard that term yet, or talked about the structure? No, okay. So we'll get into a little bit of the response wiring diagram here in a minute. But broad brush, there are federal regional response teams. There are 10 of them for the U.S. And they're made up primarily of federal response agencies, but in the states they also have state representatives. So our regional response team is RRT9. I'm going to probably abbreviate it from here on out as RRT. OSPR is one of the OSPR is one of the members of the RRT. And they have to approve the use of all applied response technologies to address a spill within federal jurisdiction. And federal jurisdiction is not just federal water. It's a spill to which the feds respond. Okay, so we've got an overlay there, state and federal. OSPR is primarily state waters, but if there's, say, an offshore spill that could threaten or impact state waters, then we definitely want to know how we can help in the planning and the response for that. And our expertise at this point is deep enough that we can offer quite a bit of benefit, I think, to Coast Guard and other entities responding in federal waters, whether it's a fishery closure that hasn't yet impacted state waters, or an ART use that is not specific to state waters. We tend to work as a team member, and in some cases as the lead, to assist the Coast Guard and the RT in making decisions about this. Here's a definition of an oil spill cleanup agent, an OSCA. It's a chemical or any other substance that can be used for removing, dispersing, or cleaning up oil or its residues in or on any waters of the state. Again, fresh or marine, estuarine, doesn't matter to us, any waters in the state. I don't think it applies to groundwater. I get the feeling we have to deal with chemicals used in fracking. I hope that's the case. But for anything on the surface of the water that can be used to clean up oil, we do weigh in on that. And we have a licensing program, which we're the only state that has a program that actually reviews products for licensing, or offers, reviews and then offers an exemption. The other thing that another thing that's different about us is that the regulations under Electric King ask us to evaluate products for the toxicity, but under Fish and Wildlife regulations, we can also look at substances that provide other effects. Like if we put this product out, and it's not toxic, we've determined it as not toxic, but could it have some other effect? Can we put out a peat-based sorghum product, and its pH will affect the surrounding waters, especially if we're using it in shallower waters? Or can we use particles of something that are great at sorting oil, but then all of a sudden the birds and fish say, whoa, you sent me some food. And they're ingesting it and considering it food. Their bellies are considering it food. And we're not sure if that's going to have some other effect outside of toxicity. So we kind of look at the whole schmagola, and it totally irritates people that we do this. Especially people that have a product that say, well, it's not toxic, it's organic, or it's natural. And it's just like everything you put in the water could have a potential effect. Nothing is benign, right? So we try to kind of look at what a product offers and just understand what that is. It may be that even if it has an effect, that's an acceptable effect in some spill responses. Maybe we can agree that that's okay. But that's the other thing that we do. So we do license OSPR cleanup agents. The officer administrator also has the authority over that process, and he very kindly delegated it to me. So they got to be licensed by the administrator before the use, and that means reviewed and given a license, or reviewed and given an exemption. There's some unlicensed products that could be used during an actual oil spill response. got time for it. But there may be some products that are out there that we haven't had time to license that are just the fit for a particular spill response. And there could be some pilot testing and perhaps approvals for use of unlicensed products in those cases. But that's like a one-time exemption and approval, and you got to come back in and get a real license. At the federal end, there's also a process, no big surprise. I had said before that the RRT needs to approve the use of all ARTs, including OSPR cleanup agents. So how do they know what's good to use? So at the federal end, the U.S. EPA and under the National Contingency Plan have a product schedule. And they've got categories of OSPR cleanup agents that they take applications for from various vendors or whatever. They review them. US EPA has some protocols for, say, testing the efficacy, the effectiveness of some of the dispersants. They're coming up with some effectiveness tests for other types of agents. They have one for bioremediants. They're coming up with one for another category we'll talk about in a minute, surface washing agents. But for the most part, the feds are looking at, okay, how do you classify this product, you vendor? What are you calling this product? Are you calling it a sorbent or a solidifier? Are you calling it a dispersant or a cleaning agent? They have a big miscellaneous category that's like everything else. And then they have to do toxicity tests on it, on some freshwater species, and report those tests. They have to do tests for heavy metals and total chlorinated hydrocarbons and report the results of those. So there is a fairly deep amount of information that US EPA asks of its vendors before allowing their product to be listed on the product schedule. But there aren't any thresholds, you know, so if say something, if a product is something that would raise our eyebrows in terms of toxicity, US EPA said, well, we're going to put it on a list because we think the information provided is true. It's up to the Coast Guard or any other federal on-sea coordinator to decide whether they want to use that product for a particular situation. And that's where people like Jordan or me come in and say, okay, what do we know about this product? What do we really know about this product? And would we want to use it? So the listing on the product schedule is required before a product can be used in a federally led response. But lots of times we don't know that much about it. It's not a licensing program. There are no thresholds established. It's the vendor provides the information. The US EPA determines if that information appears to be correct, and then they list all the information that the vendor provided, including the toxicity information.
So you said that the toxicity testing is done on freshwater species, and why wouldn't they do it on saltwater? Is that because of the body of literature, or because certain compounds would be much more toxic in a saltwater environment than in freshwater?
They and then Jordan or anybody from oh.
It's been a while since I looked at the product schedule, but I think they do some standard toxicity testing.
Yeah, it kind of varies a little bit. Mostly they're trying to establish a species that can be used as a standard. So mysis shrimp or lemon joggers, silver-side fish or something like that are kind of a standard test species.
Right. And
then you get kind of apples to apples. They're readily available to labs for testing. And so in the protocols that US EPA has established, it said, okay, use critters like this and test them like this to standards like this. And if they get their data from an accredited lab, at least it gives us something in a way for us to compare product to product. This product had at least a concentration of 50 parts per million for this critter. gives us, information on commonly tested species that we can sort of, have some sort of test results to compare to each other. So, to be used in California, they've got to be on the product schedule and licensed by us. And the and licensed by us is specific to state waters, but it's the policy of the RRT that we would ask, Coast Guard or the EPA or any other federal NC coordinator to consider, at least first, products that are also licensed by California, because we've given them a little more of a steely-eyed squint. One thing that the federal listing does that we don't do is they offer a categorical exemption for all sorbents. So if a vendor says, oh, my stuff's just a sorbent, they say, okay, we'll give you an exemption. And we look at it a little bit differently, and partly because of that other effects sort of thing. You can have a sorbent that may be not toxic, or relatively not toxic compared to other products, but it might have some other effect. And so sometimes with our sorbents, we give them a license, and sometimes we give them an exemption. It all depends on what our review tells us. But the federal side exempts all the sorbents, and that means they can be used without any additional permits from the RRT before being used on a particular incident. So, generally speaking, though, products have to be on the product schedule or given an exemption by them. Sorbents always are. They're registered. They're listed. They kind of take the information as it's presented to them and say, they do make an assessment of whether or not they think that information is true, but they don't qualify it any more than that. So they're not licensed. It's not licensed. But it does mean that anything on the product schedule can be used by the FOSC. Still need RRT approval. Sometimes that RRT approval can come in the form of a pre-approval. We'll talk a little bit about that too. And there are some other things that can be used to kind of help sift through all the chemical and biological sorbent alternatives. The selection guide, which used to be a NOAA thing, but we think now it's being held by the National Response Team. It's available online. They talk about all different kinds of spill response technologies, but they do emphasize to have good background, pros and cons for all the different applied response technologies. And then ARTES, ARTES stands for Applied Response Technology Evaluation System. It's another screening tool. Okay, so a little more on the federal planning and how they handle response. The National Response Team, which is Big Daddy, does the national planning and coordination. Their products are the National Contingency Plan, and as mentioned before, they kind of, under that, maintain the listings on the NCP product schedule. And then they provide some general overarching policy and program guidance. You get down to the regional response teams, there are 10 of them, remember, for the United States. Some of those are kind of inland, too. Like our regional response team, RRT9, covers California, Nevada, and Arizona. So you can think, that's not all marine. But response is not just about marine. So these regions, the RRT areas include marine and freshwater response and planning for that. So each of the 10 RRTs do that more regional planning and coordination for preparedness and response, including applied response technologies. I mentioned before, it's mostly made up of federal agencies with some hook in the water, oil spill response. And then when you talk about RRT, sometimes you talk about the standing RRT that meets 3 or 4 times a year and hashes over stuff and gets updated on everything. But then you'll also have incident-specific RRTs. And that's the much smaller group of 3 to 5 agencies that are called together to make decisions about a particular response. That will include US EPA, Coast Guard, if it's a marine water spill, federal water spill, OSPR, if it's in or threatening state waters. And then we'll also include conversations with the Department of Interior and Department of Commerce, so we can get the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service in there, and sanctuaries and stuff to talk about their critters and habitats of concern, and make sure that whatever we do has their knowledge. May not absolutely have their concurrence, but has their response decision. So there's an incident-specific RRT, and that's what we're calling up during response drills. We're calling up an incident-specific RRT to weigh in on our recommendations. Yes?
Is this region match up with FEMA regions?
The question was, do the RRT regions match up with FEMA regions? And who can answer that question?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. There we go. John says yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's talk a little more specifically about some of these chemical countermeasures. There's a bunch of different types, right? Some we know more about, and some we know less about. So some have more of a potential plague, spill response, and some don't. And I don't think I necessarily ordered these in terms of, how much consideration they've gotten. I will say that emulsion treating agents are probably the ones we consider the least. Once weather has worked on oil and water, you'll start getting this foam, this mousse kind of building up, right? And depending on the type of oil, depending on your weather conditions, that might happen sooner or later, but it almost always happens. And lots of times what people want to do, because dispersants don't really work on oil that has emulsified, instant burn is really hard to get to go on oils that emulsified. So people say, well, there's a way we can kind of break that back down again, so that we can do some of these other treatments. So an emulsion treating agent could do that. It's more commonly seen on vessels in the oil-water separation systems, where they'll kind of treat the product that they've gathered up so that it can get through the separation systems. It's used on land and facility applications more than it's been used in the ocean. We don't have anything licensed as an emulsion treating agent for use in California waters, and I'm not sure there's one on the NCP product schedule either. There might be, but they haven't been used very much, or even tested very much. Vasoelastizers is kind of a generic term for anything that kind of changes the oil, changes the mushiness of it. So if you can change that oil from kind of a slick to something that's more like a gel, or in some cases even a solid, then that's a way to maybe grab it and haul it out of there. And it could really work for spills that are kind of starting to sheen and get away from you. And if you can kind of secure it, or kind of bind the leading edge of it, then maybe you can keep it from spreading too far, making matters worse. So these come in a variety of flavors too. They can come in as a liquid, and that's more commonly used in something like a leaking vessel or a tank or something like that to kind of make that mass more cohesive. It doesn't make a lot of sense to use it in a vessel that's leaking water, leaking oil to the water, because then you're leaking this product to the water too. So there's kind of a limited use for the liquid elasticity modifiers, although there is one that's licensed in California, it's on the product schedule, Elastol, that's gotten some pretty good testing. It seems to do pretty well, but when it's used in like a wave tank or a more open water setting, it does make the oil more cohesive, but then it's kind of hard to pick it up again. It kind of breaks apart, so you try to like break it out of the water. But it does seem to let that product go through the mechanical skimmers, okay? Whereas some other solidified products just make the skimmers totally choke up. So there's a kind of a class of those. Solidifiers are the ones that kind of get the most attention. I think probably have the most response interest, at least to me. We'll talk about some of the constraints, I guess, on their use in a couple minutes here. Shoreline cleaners are also called beach cleaners or surface washing agents. They're used more for cleaning hard surfaces, and those can be constructed surfaces like riprap or pier pilings or launch ramps or whatever else, but it can also be natural surfaces like the rocks along a riverbank. And I don't know if I have a slide on this later or not, so I'll mention it now. In California, we have two that are licensed, and they're both the lift and float variety. You can have a cleaner that basically acts like a dispersant, so you get that oil off the surface, but if you're just flushing it back into the water, clean the hard surfaces at all. We want something that lifts the oil off that surface, but then floats it back in the water into a contained area so we can slurp it back up again. It gives us a second chance at it. So our two licensed products are our cleaning agents, or the lift and float product. Herding agents, we haven't used much of. Dispersants act like this too, where they kind of, as soon as you put dispersant on the surface of the water, it looks like the oil's being pushed away. Herding agents do that a little more actively. And the application that is most commonly seen for these is like for use on sheens and harbors. Normally we don't go after sheens in terms of response, they're just too hard to get. But if you can use a herder and kind of move that surface sheen to a collection point or away from a sensitive area, then it has a potential application there. There's quite a bit of research going on now in terms of using herding agents as a way to concentrate oil for in-situ burn-in up in the Arctic. So there's a little bit of traction on that kind of research. Dispersants, you know about those, and we'll talk about them a lot more here. And the bioremediants are another category of chemical countermeasures, more on the biological side, but we categorize them as a functional cleaning agent. Okay, so in particular with the emulsion treating agents, I think because I hit that last slide so hard, I'm going to go through these next few real quickly. So the emulsions are formed when you apply energy to oil and water. They become then difficult to disperse or burn or mechanically recover. Emulsion breakers have been used in field production, but not generally available off the shelf. There were some studies by Alaska Clean Seas saying if you're working on, some products can work at about 70% emulsified oil and still burn. But again, we need a lot more research on this to find the actual utility of it. And again, those trade-offs. Even if you get something to work, do you want it? Elasticity modifiers are those things that kind of gel or make oil a little more cohesive. They become a semi-solid or a solid mass. And the benefit to them is, lots of the times actually chemically change the oil and bind it so that it doesn't re-sheen. So if you use, say, a conventional sorbent boom or pad on oil, and it's really big to lift it out of the water, lots of times it's drip, right? Thanks. What good does that do? Whereas the solidifier binds it and it doesn't re-sheen. And so the application we see for some of this is particularly with wetland habitats where maybe you had oiling vegetation, but with the next tide cycle, some of that can slip off. Is there a kind of a easy and environmentally friendly way in terms of ingress and egress to get at that re-sheening oil? And solidifier products might be one way to do that. We do have both state, the OSPR, and the RRT policies that say we can't use solidifiers in a loose or broadcast form. They have to be self-contained. They have to be as a boom or pad or sock or a pillow that you can pick back up out of the water. Because that is the objective. That's the goal with all our oil spill cleanup agents. If we put them in the water, we want to be able to get them back out with oil attached. The exception, of course, being dispersants. Try to get that back out of water, because the whole point is to get it spread through the water. But for the most part, if something goes in, we've got a responsibility to try and get it back out. And so solidifiers in the self-contained form work for that. The loose and broadcast solidifiers, I think probably have great utility. I think are very deserving of further exploration. But we get some resistance on that from the RRT because we are worried about whether fish and wildlife would inadvertently consume this stuff. But it may be a good way to handle some of the smaller spills. It has been used effectively in some international spills, used loose and broadcast. The process is, the problem is that sometimes that solidified mass is hard to pick back up, especially with the mechanical skimmers. And sometimes it just makes a bigger mess out of the mess you already have. But I think it's got potential. And one of the potentials I would think would be for those open ocean spills where you do have a sheen or a slit moving towards shore. Your mechanical recovery folks aren't going to be able to get to a try and secure it a little bit. And that has been tried in some international testing as well. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay, so the shoreline cleaning agents, also you hear them talk about surface washing agents or beach cleaners. Kind of similar to dispersants in a way that they have a surfactant component to them, but we want the lift and float kind. There are some clean and disperse kinds on the product schedule. The only two we have licensed in California are the lift and float type. They can be used alone, but we'll show some pictures of them also being used with water. They've been used, some additional testing was done during Deepwater Horizon to see whether they could be used to clean marsh plants. One of our OSPR studies looked at whether they could be used to clean marsh plants. So they have potential utility there, but the concern there is that if you spray some of this cleaning agent onto the oil vegetation, sometimes you then have to often flush it. And then if you flush it, if you're too aggressive about that, you can disturb the underlying sediment and create a problem for plants that way. So with care, it may have some application utilities, but for the most part, we use it on hard surfaces. So here's just some examples of how you can wash stuff. You can kind of do the passive flooding. This one. You can do low pressure washing, or you can do the high pressure washing. And based on the Exxon Valdez experience and I guess common sense, we only do that on substrates where we're not as worried about whether or not there are critters clinging. Kathleen's going to talk in her follow-up presentation. She's going to give a presentation on biodegradation studies following a spill in California. And they were extensively planned for, but not actually used during Deepwater Horizon, and she may tell part of that story too. But people are always interested. Why don't you just bioremediate the spill? And it does have a lot of interest and potential. That can kind of come in several flavors. You can use microbes. You can add microbes, and they can be either native, and maybe you kind of take them out and you foster them and make a superpopulation of baby microbes and then dump them back in. Or you can add ones that may or may not be found in the area of the spill. Sometimes you don't need bugs. You just need more food for them. I mean, they're doing their job and they're kind of running out of nutrients, and so maybe you just need to add some nutrients. And that's kind of classed into bioremediants. And sometimes they have plenty of food, plenty of oil to eat, and plenty of nutrients, but they're kind of running out of oxygen. And so sometimes you can enhance. See how fast it moves? Sometimes you can enhance that by just adding oxygen. It has a slow action time. So it's not a first response tool. It's not, generally speaking, an on-water response tool. It's for 6 months down the line, after all the oiling has ended, and you've got oil in the marsh, and you want to get it off the vegetation. And the experience at Deepwater Horizon is that, well, that's all well and good. They considered a number of different products, including microbes and nutrients, but ultimately, a year later, the native bugs had already done the deal, so there was no need to add on. All right. I'm not sure if this is the best, almost for last, but we could talk for a long time on dispersants, and I'm probably going to talk on them, more than you want me to, but here we go. They're also a combination of surfactants and solvents, similar to surface washing agents. They have both an oil-liking end and a water-liking end. So those two ends kind of work to try and separate the oil from the water by reducing the tension that normally keeps them together. Depending on the type of oil, and how weathered it is, and the salinity of the water, and how much it's emulsified, dispersants may or may not work, or may work to different degrees. In all cases, though, you got to mix it up. So it requires a certain amount of energy. And that energy, that wave action, that chop on the surface of the water, sometimes exactly the same conditions that keep mechanical recovery from working very well. So that's why lots of times people have looked at dispersants as a way to address parts of the spill that mechanical can't get that. So, you know, it could fill a niche, especially for offshore California where the sea states are enough that, you know, sometimes we're going to be faced with making that decision. Can we get enough mechanical in there? Can we just wait for the seas to die down? Or should we try some dispersants while everything's still kind of far offshore? Or what should we do here? So that's the advantage, I guess one advantage that folks have seen in dispersants is it can maybe work in some of those situations where mechanical can. And if it's important to us to treat that oil, then dispersants might be a consideration. It may also be fine to just not treat the oil. Just get as much as you can for mechanical and call it a day. Depends entirely on the situation where it occurs. That first bullet is really hard for people to swallow. Especially the two dispersants, the Corexit products that we think hear of most when we talk about dispersants. There's a Corexit 9527 and Corexit 9500. 9500 is a formulation that does not have one of the components that was problematic that 9527 had. There's been a ton of research on this in California and elsewhere. And at the end of the day, most of the studies have said, you know, we like this stuff okay by itself. You know, it's not that bad by itself. It's even considered less toxic than some of the dish detergents like Dawn that we use and even use on oil wildlife. That doesn't really help. Mentally, I don't think that really helps us. Because the big concerns are, okay, what happens if you apply that dispersant to the oil? What happens then? So we know that the dispersant itself, just in the jar by itself, is not really all that toxic. We know the oil is sometimes way more toxic than the dispersant. And what happens when you put those two together? You break up that oil and you move that probably fairly thick surface slick where you can see it and where you can hope to deal with 20% of it or something, and you move it into the upper part of the water column. Now, talk about this in a minute. Our dispersant plan only really allows use over fairly deep waters. Waters deep enough to really make a cloud of the stuff, kind of like a smoke plume from a forest fire, rather than, you know, the smoke you get from a campfire. But still, you know, it's going somewhere, you know, and what happens when it goes there versus what happens if you leave it at the surface. So because it breaks up the oil into the smaller particles, it also makes the components of oil that are really toxic, those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, those are the nasty bits. All of a sudden, critters in the upper water column, they wouldn't have seen that, they wouldn't care, are now seeing it, and they can take it in. And then our concern is, okay, what happens if they take it in? Some critters just say, okay, I saw it, I ate it, they left. And others are saying, I saw it, and it's making me feel a little funky. And I think this is the fun part about how complex this question is. Every critter, every life stage of that critter, time of year will make a difference in what their response is going to be. That I think is the fun part. So it is, any dispersant use decision is, okay, is that better than not doing it? You know, again, we're not looking for the whole fix, we're looking for an incremental benefit. Sometimes it may be tiny, but we're trying to see if there will be some environmental positive to the overall negative. Generally speaking, the lighter the oil is, the lighter the crude oil, the easier it is to disperse. But we don't use it on, or plan to use it on gasoline or diesel or jet fuels, mostly because those fairly quickly sheet out, evaporate, and if you were to apply dispersants to them, the layer is so thin that those dispersant droplets might just punch right through and not really work on the oil. So we don't recommend use on any of those lighter end things. Actually, the category of oils that they will work on, not too light, but not too heavy, fairly narrow set of oils. But we plan for it anyway. We plan the dickens out of it just because. So this is actually looks a lot like what Jordan showed you with the Galveston pictures. If oil is on the surface, you apply dispersant to it. Dispersant attaches to the oil and it breaks it into droplets. But you need to stir it. You need to shake it, or you need waves to kick it up for you. Make it mix. And then the idea is that you break it into like, the optimal dispersed droplet size is like between 70 and 100 microns, which is about the thickness of a hair. So all of a sudden, you may not see it in the water. These droplets are so small that you may not see it in the water, but the critters can see it. And they can now take them up. They're of a size that some of them will be able to take them up. And here, I know this is also hard to see, but these little darker dots are like the dispersant droplet inside a mysid shrimp. So that's what it kind of looks like, or being taken up by a larva fish. So relative to the size of the critters, they're now consumable by those critters. And again, it's not so much, I mean, oil by itself is a mess, but there's so many different components to oil. I mean, oil is a messy soup that a different cook cooks every day with different you know, when you're talking about different oils. So they have different metals in them, just a different suite of contaminants, but always the one we worry about the most are the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. There's a gazillion of those too. Because when they're this size, they can get across the cell membrane, fish gills, and create whole new routes of exposure and toxicity. Just because you're exposed doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have, you know, a toxic reaction to it. Again, it kind of depends on concentration, whether you're in the path, and whether you're particularly sensitive or at a life stage where you'll be particularly sensitive to that being there. This is also hard for me to buy off on. The ultimate breakdown products of oil are carbon dioxide and water. How can that be bad, right? It takes a long time to get to that point, though, and in the meantime, you've got these other contaminants in the oil that also have to be broken down. So it's a mess. One of the perspective, I guess, is part of it. One of the things I read, it was in a book, I think Oil in the Sea is what it was called. It was published in 2003. It had a really simple title. It might have been Oil in the Sea, or Oil in the Sea. But it kind of looked at how oil got to the ocean. You know, what's out there already? And 8% of the oil in the ocean comes from spills. Other 92% comes from seeps or runoff from land. That to me is amazing. The benefit is that it means that there's a lot of oil in the environment already. I guess that's not the benefit. But in terms of critters that are there, that see that as a food source, and are adapted to seeing that as a food source, they are there. And they can remediate a lot of this oil that they commonly see in their environment. But what happens when we make the jobs harder? So talk a little bit about the California Dispersant Plan. Policy-wise, I think in light of the difficulty of getting response resources out to our offshore areas where the water is often lumpy, and you could be putting your workers in peril. Now, not only are they not effectively able, I mean, they can attack that oil slick with all the resources they have, but it's all about encountering. You've got this vessel with some boom, you know, behind it, or two boats pulling boom and trying to scoop up a little bit of oil, but there's much oil, you know, in this big oil slick. So it's a tough job to ask mechanical to do any more than it can do. And then you get above a certain sea stage, like about 3 or 4 feet wave height, and a lot of that oil just slips under the boom instead of staying in the boom. So it gets difficult to do all the work mechanically. And people were thinking, so what do we do with the rest of it? If we can only optimally get 20% of the oil from mechanical means, what do we do with the other 80%? And some of that will just naturally weather. I mean, it's not like the oil just sits there waiting for you to do something with it. I mean, it's already going through all these weathering processes. The evaporation, there will be physical dispersing going on, you know, just natural wave action working on the surface slick. There will be physical dispersion, even if you don't add chemicals to it. So there's a lot of weathering that goes on that affects that overall oil budget. And you guys have probably talked about oil budget a little bit. So that's all going on. And then the mechanical folks are out there trying to scoop up what they can of what remains. And then you're trying to think, okay, what do we do still with the other oil that's there? If we do anything. So the RT9 asked each of our 6 area committees, we've since kind of lumped up into, I guess we still have 5 or 6 6 area committees, but we have like 3 big area plans now. But they asked at the time our 6 area committees to recommend zones for dispersant use. And this is kind of a trickle-down request. It came from the national response team, down to the regional response team, and the regional response teams punted to the area committees, because that's where I keep thinking the NRT is saying, yeah, we should have a party. And the RT says, okay, this date and this time and this location. And the area committees actually do the planning for the party and make it come off. So I kind of see that here. We got this kind of punting of requests from the NRT down to the RTs, and the RTs asked each of their area committees, at least in California, to do some planning for dispersant use. And then the area committees were asked to come up with some recommendations. And I'll tell you kind of the categories of recommendations that we came up with. But they did. And the RT approved the recommendations and made some plans to help implement those recommendations. So this is what they came up with. The RT gave us 3 different types of zones that we could potentially use. One was pre-approval. And that means, remember I said before that the RRT has to approve any use of applied response technology, but that could come in the form of a pre-approval. This is what it would be. It would be an approval only goes to the federal on-scene coordinator. It doesn't go to anybody else. But the pre-approval would be from the RRT to the federal on-scene coordinator saying, if you have an incident and all these boxes have been checked, that's what mine is, a bunch of boxes to check, then it's up to you whether or not you want to use dispersants. Because we've decided that in this pre-approval zone, given what we know about the resources out there, their sensitivities, the possible routes of exposure, we think there would be a net environmental benefit. So it's up to you whether you think there would be a net political benefit. But the pre-approval allows the federal on-scene coordinator to go through an even more expedited run of the checklist because that net environmental benefit analysis is already been done. So there's a pre-approval zone is one type of zone. Pre-approval with consultation is another type of zone. We never figured out how to do that, so we never used it. And then the other thing is, we can't decide this ahead of time. You'll have to come to the RRT for an incident-specific approval. So those are the 2 we use, either pre-approval or go to the RRT and let them share the headache of decision-making. So what we came up with all those years ago was pre-approval zones would include federal, like I said, all our planning was just for federal waters, the 3 to 200 miles for sure, to offshore. Although we looked at all the resources that could potentially be impacted by that decision. So we actually looked from the shoreline out to 200 miles and from the surface down to the bottom to say, if you did just mechanical, or if you did just dispersions, or if you did just or you did nothing at all, what are the trade-offs? So we got a lot of the resource information outside of that 300 to 200 mile zone, but the zones themselves only apply to the 3 to 200. So, pre-approval, 3 to 200 miles from the coastline, and that includes island shorelines, right? Except waters that are part of a national marine sanctuary or within 3 miles of the California-Mexico border. There is now, we started it a number of years ago, but consultations under the Endangered Species Act, Section 7. These consultations have started a long time ago, but they've been updated and refined and currently in front of the agencies for their review and approval. So those are asking about the NIMS and Fish and Wildlife Service, whether or not they have species that or critical habitat that would be affected by dispersant use offshore to the point where they recommend not doing it. And then all the other waters are considered, you got to go to the RRT. So all the state waters, waters that are part of a national marine sanctuary, waters within 3 miles of the border here. Also, waters that are within a mile from the Nantucket fish streams. It seems stupid to me because, you know, those are all within 3 miles from shore anyway, right? Seems like they're covered. And then post-Deepwater Horizon, because we realized that all our planning in California assumed a surface use of dispersants, and for a pretty short time period, because we've got a short window of opportunity for any type of oil that might spill here. We don't have the platforms or wells with a positive pressure that are going to spew for months, like happened during the conduct period of Deepwater Horizon. don't have pipelines that are going to spew volumes at that time. So we're not going to have the types of uncontrolled releases or hard to control releases like we saw during Deepwater Horizon. So we're expecting that if we get a spill that we even consider dispersant use on, it would be probably from one or two large vessels that would bump in the night. And it would be if they were carrying a dispersible oil. And probably the one we're looking at most is the Alaska North Slope. The oils produced in California from the seeps and from the platforms tend to be really heavy, and they're probably not dispersible. So our greatest risk is probably from an incident at sea, probably a vessel or two vessels spilling. And I think that's got huge potential for a huge volume. We've got some very large crude carriers out there, and there's a potential for them to bump into each other. Low potential maybe, but nevertheless. So anyway, because we never really thought about dispersant use for subsea releases, or that they could even last for more than 5 days at the surface, we have said that even in a pre-approval zone, that those aren't uses that we planned for. That's not what we did our net environmental benefit analysis around. Those weren't the expectations and the conditions of that analysis. So if you have a reason for doing that, subsea application, or use at the surface for more than 5 days, you've got to go to the RT and get there. Even if you're in a pre-approval zone, those are not pre-approved uses. So it seems like a big plan. All of our statewide plans, the ones that kind of apply statewide, are actually part of the regional contingency plan. And we started out thinking maybe we'd make the dispersant plan, each area committee would have its own dispersant plan. And we thought, well, this is silly. Because the process for making a decision about whether or not to use dispersants, that's the same process statewide. You have resources in each area that might be a little bit different. And so we have appendices in the dispersant plan that treat those different regional resources, or at least list them and consider them so we don't forget about them. But the plan itself, the decision-making plan, is statewide. It doesn't change if you're in Eureka or if you're in San Diego. So they're part of the RCP. And that includes checklists for both types of zones, the pre-approval and the RRT approval, and then a hunk of appendices for, okay, there's a bunch of different subsets to this plan, like how to do the wildlife spotting, or how to call out the SMART team that the Pacific Strike team has for monitoring whether or not dispersant's been effective. How do you do your seafood safety shenanigans? How do you do your public communications? How do you do the ESA Section 7 consultation if you're doing an emergency consultation? What are all of those dispersant resources, and how soon can they get here? So we've got all these appendices of how to do this. So you've got the two flow charts and then the cookbook, basically, for how to get through the flow chart. And all these embedded plans and protocols, let's talk about it. There's a number of different ways you can apply dispersants, but typically by plane, because they can fly fairly low to the water and minimize how much of the dispersant drifts away in the wind instead of contacting the oil. They can go back and forth several times in their spray transects and apply quite a bit in one go. And C-130 is kind of the biggest dispersant application plane that is available for this. But it can also be applied by bucket from a helicopter. It might make some sense, say, if you had a dispersant release around an offshore platform or something that was fairly localized. And it can also be applied from arms running off a vessel. But again, you got your how much area can you cover kind of question that you need to answer. And I don't want to dwell on Deepwater Horizon, but I will. People always ask, so how many, because Deepwater Horizon, we've done all this planning in California, but never used dispersants in California, at least not since Leopard King came into play. And so not that much real-world experience to sort of test all those assumptions we made during our dispersant planning. But then the Deepwater Horizon kind of jumped in there and gave us a lot of data to kind of back up the research data that was all from the lab or wave tanks or things like that. So here's a real-world case of dispersant use. I'm just going to focus on these for the spraying on the surface. So we had gallons of dispersant used. Most of that was the corrects at 9,500. This is kind of the preferred one because it doesn't have that one component that is a little problematic, and 9527 has that. But kind of used it the stocks at 9527 and then switched over to 9500 and used that for the rest response. So that's pretty much how much was used. And this is kind of compared to what was the overall oil budget, and this is from August 4th. So that was pretty close to, I forget when the well was capped, but somewhere around then. So directly recovered from the wellhead, mechanically skimmed, accounted for about 20% of the oil. There was about another 25% that evaporated or naturally dissolved in natural dispersion. Dispersion and dissolving are kind of two different things. You don't think of oil as being able to dissolve, but parts of it can. And it actually dissolves into the water. So that accounts for that. Versus dispersed, which is these little particles that stay as particles, but they're floating around through the water. So that's dispersed. And the chemically dispersed was about 8%. It seems like if you're putting 1 million gallons on the surface, that's got more than 8%. I think this includes both subsea and surface. And then burning took care of about 5% of that. But although those who were doing the burning think that, probably they got all of it. And then there's a certain amount of it that, just remains out there. Will happen with any spill. And these are mostly me talking. These bullets here. My sense, but I think it's also a shared sense with other folks that have evaluated census. I mean, there are some quirky names in how dispersants were applied at the beginning, but they were consistent with policies. There was a pre-approval zone off Louisiana, and that's where the dispersants were applied with the FOSC approval. So he directed the response. They always said, oh God, it's the RP making you use them. But the RP is part of the Unified Command, but is not the entirety of the Unified Command. So the FOSC did direct those responses. There was a bucket load of monitoring that went on for both the effectiveness and then also the impacts on human health and impacts on the water and wildlife. Does that mean that everybody was happy? No. I mean, of course, there's still claims about effects on human health that are resounding through the courts today, and that may resound for a while. EPA did do some additional analysis on their dispersants, and as I said before, that when products get listed on the product schedule, they're not really teased apart too much. But Deepwater Horizon made them tease into the corrections a little bit. And FDA and NOAA did a paper that kind of looked at those components, looked at whether or not those components were already being used in foods and cosmetics and cleaning agents and stuff that were already approved by then, and yes, they were. Many of those, so OTC, you probably know this is over-the-counter medications. GRAS stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. But those are in the applications and at the concentrations for human use, right? Doesn't necessarily talk about wildlife impacts or marine habitats. Also, a lot of seafood safety samples taken. Even with all those dispersants and all that oil, NOAA NIMS had a hard time coming up with any hits. I think they came up with one critter, one sample that had oil at a concentration that hit a threshold. Who would have thought? I mean, you would think that all that oil in the environment would have done something. But all the fish were, even during the height of the fishery closure, were probably safe to eat. But of course, none of them could be sold in the market because there was the fear about tainting in actual contamination. So this is what we learned. We had a plan for subsea use or surface use for an extended period of time, so we told our dispersant plan that that would be an exception, and we would need RT approval for that. All the rest of our net environmental benefit assumptions still do seem to apply. We do have that Section 7 review in front of National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're taking a look at it. And once those ESA consultations are complete, we'll go ahead and update the CPP. If California dispersant plan is really woefully out of date at this point. And when we're drilling it, we kind of keep using the basic framework of it, and I update some of the appendices so we can use them during drills, but there's a lot about all our ART plans that need to be updated. Okay, and then, yes?
So, question on dispersion, so the federal on-scene coordinator is the one who has the authority to make that decision. Is it kind of come out of unified command from that, or is it just the federal on-scene coordinator?
So the question is, and this would be for the pre-approval zone.
Okay.
Well, actually, it kind of applies in both cases, where the federal on-scene coordinator can work under a pre-approval, or goes to the RRT to get approval, and the RRT gives it to him. And it's still at his discretion whether or not he wants to do it. In terms of the unified command, the federal on-scene coordinator gets about 51% of the vote, right? And that's why I keep saying it's an FOSC decision. And this approval from the RRT, whether it's in the form of a pre-approval or an incident-specific approval, only goes to the FOSC. But we brief the entire unified command, just as we're briefing everybody else to make sure that they're all on the same page. So they kind of sign off on it. Doesn't really matter. It's still an FOSC decision. If the entire unified command said, oh, we're for it, the FOSC could still say, nah, I don't want it. I thought about it, so I don't want it. So it's basically in one person's hands. The other hand that's holding that hand is the US EPA, and they're basically the only ones that have the vote, especially for federal water use. But they've always said that they would not approve a dispersant use unless all the trustee agencies were on board with it. I mean, what good does that do? All right, in-situ burning. We'll spend a little time on that. When these slides were compared originally, I mean, we didn't have much experience with in-situ burning either. Deepwater Horizon changed that. So this is another advantage similar to mechanical in that you actually get the oil off the water. We'd love it. We'd love to be able to do it. It does remove large quantities of spilled oil, and that's an advantage over the kind of conventional mechanical. It doesn't leave much residue. You blow up the volatiles at the same time, and the combustion products, here's back to the forest fire, they disperse in the air. Probably similar to what chemically dispersed oil would do underwater, but at least you can see it, right? It's a little easier to see where it goes. You can burn on land or you can burn on water. Probably more of our experience, at least in California, is considering burning on land of oil vegetation. The major concern is to human health, well, critter health too, but the bits. It's all about the bits, right? This time it's the bits, the particulate matter that comes out of the soot plume. And there is a risk to human health if those particles get so small that you not only inhale it, but you can't get them back out. We know how good our lungs are at keeping stuff in and how long it takes to get stuff back out. So PM10 stands for particulate matter of 10 micrometers, and that's kind of the cutoff point for what we worry about versus what we know. And EPA, again, and air districts are thinking about lowering this to a PM standard of 2.5 micrometers. So, again, it's a balancing act, right? The soot plume might dissipate, especially if you're several miles beyond the burn site and not close to human populations. And if the oil is not burned, it still presents a health risk. So what do you do with it? And those health risks in this case are from what is acronymed BTEX, and that stands for benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. They're carcinogens and they're teratogens, so they cause birth defects. We just know oil is bad stuff, no matter what we do with it. So in-situ burning also has its limits. It has its advantages. We can remove large amounts of oil, actually gets it out of there with minimal impacts probably to wildlife and people, but it's limited by the oil has to be thick enough to burn if you can't burn machines. If it gets too weathered or too emulsified, like more than about 60% emulsified, it won't burn. Oceanographic conditions, it has to be contained before it can be burned. And if you have an active sea state, the same things that limit the ability to mechanically collect the oil is also going to limit the ability to boom for in-situ burn. And even though people say, oh, you can boom with regular boom, you'll just burn it up. You'll just put more out, you'll burn it up too. We typically use fire retardant containment boom, and we don't have any in California. And the closest is in Washington. It's about 24 hours away. And practically speaking, by the time we could get a decision to use it, if we were in that little sweet spot of a big spill that can't be mechanically contained, but the sea state is low enough so we can do an in-situ burn. By the time we figured all that out, the boom could be here. So you got to contain it. You got to light it on fire. It's about the minimum thickness for the oil is about 2 to 3 millimeters, which seems like nothing. But it's really thick in terms of oil. Normal thick oil is considered like 1 millimeter. So you've got to really be able to gather it up and thicken it to support the burn. And you're kind of basically lighting the top part, and then it burns into that thicker layer of top.
I have a quick question. What would be a situation where it'd be contained for in-situ burning but not mechanical?
Say that again.
A situation where you can contain it for in-situ burning but not mechanically burning.
That's why I think that's why people up north for the Arctic are looking at chemical herders for that, and why I'm interested in maybe solidifiers for that. But basically speaking, you've got to concentrate it. Unless it's going to go into some other structure like a shore or something like that. But we wouldn't be burning that close to shore. He's giving me the nice thing.
I would answer that, but it might be a question of storage, right? You get a lot of material and that you might not have enough storage capability to bring on. So you might be able to burn more than you could bring on and store, depending on where it is and the location you're getting from that.
And what they did
One
during
possibility,
what they did during Deepwater Horizon was they did mechanical in-situ burn and dispersant operations all at once. So the in-situ burn guys would go into the slick, carve a piece of it off and drag it off, burn it, and then the mechanical was working on that stuff back there, and the dispersants were working on another edge of it. So they were kind of all in their separate arenas working on one piece of the spill.
How was the residual cleanup?
That, like with any ARTs, we're supposed to clean up the residue, right? There's not much residue from an in-situ burn, but it can be like little cakes of, kind of agglomerated ash on the surface, kind of sticky stuff that can't be, raked up, or nets could be drawn through, but some of it does sink. And so then I got to worry about whether we're sending stuff probably to the bottom in that case. But burning is fairly complete, and so the amount of residue left is pretty good.
But has anyone ever looked at toxicity characteristics
Of the residue?
of the residue?
I think so. That sounds like mine. I think because I'm pretty sure they
It's
have,
not
but
particularly
I
satisfying.
cannot, I know, none of the reason that's my answer. I can look that up for you. Is Jordan still here?
No.
Were any toxic studies done on the in-situ burn residue during the water?
Not to my knowledge.
Jerry has a project with LSU, and they're looking at the burn residue.
Okay.
There you go.
And I know that the coal, the Army Corps of Engineers Coal Regions Research Environmental Lab is doing some studies on the last year or so for residue from some of their testing. Just I don't know what their results are.
So progress.
Microbial degradation.
Okay, we're going to have to speed this up here.
Sorry, and there are publications on that that are available on that.
Yeah, there are public, something like an OS will just spur further research, right? Not spur. And so it sounds like Deepwater Horizon has enlisted some more research, and the anticipation of Arctic oil drilling has spurred some more. But I'm not sure there was that much done. There was a bunch of North Sea trials done like 20 years ago, but I don't know if they actually studied the burn residue. Good question. Okay, I'm going to have to quicken my pace here. The other thing with in-situ burning is that if the wind shifts and it's going to a place you don't want it to go, you've got to be able to ground that spill. You've got to be able to shut that fire off. And the way you do it speeding up your boom tone, so you're basically dragging more water when the top of the spill snuff out. Some more on the mechanics when the bird's done. You gotta try and clean up that residue. There's an estimate for you. Okay, as we get closer to shore, we have designated zones for the various air districts where right now we have a pre-approval given to the federal on-sea coordinator to do an institute burn if you're at least 35 miles from shore. As you get quicker to shore, the RRT needs to approve. And then as you get even closer to shore, there's specific distances from shore that the air districts have established as their quick approval zones. And it's a jagged set of boxes. These apply if the prevailing winds are offshore or parallel to shore. So these don't apply if the storm can drive onto shore. But if you're off the north coast, the Air Quality Management District just said, well, at least if you're at least half a mile from shore, and the winds are blowing offshore, about 4 minutes. So, and that distance varies depending on where you're on shore. In Monterey Bay, it's such a deep bay, and the winds are really dynamic and kind of squirrely and unpredictable. They could not come up with any quick zones. So during a drill or spill, we contact our air district. They can maybe do some air modeling for us and some forecasting, and they could help provide some monitors along the shore and perhaps on vessels near the spill site. That's what they've said anyway. I met my summary. So I admit that there are aspects of applied response technologies that are just scary. I don't think we ever want to be in a situation where we have to use dispersants or any other cleanup measures. I think we actually want to be in a world where we don't have oil spills. If we have oil spills, though, I think it's our charge to go at it as intelligently as we can. And that means, in some cases, making the hard decisions of using something like a treatment agent. It's like applying a little bit of this, Dawn detergent to that sink full of messy dishes rather than just scrubbing it with a sponge or taking it down to the creek or something like that. Their chemicals can be your friends. I think as trustee agency representatives that we take that so seriously. I mean, I worry about this stuff when I go to sleep. Make sure that we're doing the right thing. And it's hard to tell if you're going to be doing the right thing until you get there. But we're not doing a casual thing. We're not doing a non-strategic thing. And I think we're understanding where the trade-offs are going to be, and we'd only do that thing if we perceive there would be a net benefit in the face of all the other lack of benefit. In fact, we just had a major oil spill. There's pretty good scrutiny and a pretty good body of research that makes us a little more comfortable with the use of some of these products. I have to say I'm nervous about some of the other products that would be available to the federal on-sea coordinator. They're on the product schedule, and we don't have license in California, and I haven't received that much scrutiny. So our dispersant plan, I'm just going to focus on dispersant. Our dispersant plan envisions using one of the 4 products we have license for use in California because we know about them. We know what we're getting into. We don't know about those other things. So that pre-approval, forget, does not apply to those other products on the product schedule. The federal on-scene coordinator could still use them, and that is at her discretion, and all use another product, but I bet the RRT would not approve their use without basically, we would need an emergency consultation under Section 7. We would need to do an incident-specific environmental benefit analysis, and we'd probably have to do a lot of those tailgate testings of that dispersant and prove that that's any better against your risks than what we're talking about. So I would love to see more dispersants get licensed for use in California, I'll just say, because that gives me a chance to look at it. And it gives us a chance to fold it into our planning, understanding what the risks and benefits are. We're kind of over a core exit barrel right now. That's the product we know the most about. And we have some level of comfort with it, in that we sort of know that beast a little bit.
Who pays for the licensing, the owner of the product, or?
The owner of the product. I'm not sure there's a fee for listing on the product schedule. We charge $1,000 for licensing, and $100 to $250 for So dispersant use, can you do the pre-approval or this specific approval? The results of that section 7 consultation with dispersants might change this up. I don't know, we're kind of waiting to see what will happen. Institute burning, there is a pre-approval zone, and I'm kind of wondering lately why we even have that, because I think that we could probably handle all potential institute burn decision-making with just RRT. In the time we have, we'll have quite a bit of time.